I wasn't supposed to find this. The archive room in the Hartwell Municipal Records building had been sealed for structural hazards since 1998. I only got in because the clerk assumed I was there to photograph the collapsed shelving for insurance purposes. The truth was less glamorous. I'd been chasing an unrelated zoning dispute, but once the door groaned open, the smell hit me. It was a dense, humid stench of mildew, carbon paper, and something sharper, like scorched hair. The air was thick enough to taste, a metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. My flashlight beam cut across stacks of rotting file boxes, the cardboard sagging and bleeding ink down the sides. That's when I saw it. Wedged between two filing cabinets, there was a narrow, coffin-like drawer, painted black, with no visible handle. I almost walked past it, until I noticed the scratches. Someone had gouged numbers into the wood, jagged and uneven, 1852. It was an old year, even for this place. I hooked my fingers into the seam and pulled until the drawer screamed against its rusted track. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its cover blistered and warped by moisture. When I opened it, the pages bloomed with black mold around the edges. The ink had bled into spider-like tendrils, but here and there, names were still legible. The same surname appeared 5 times, Hartwell. Each entry followed the same pattern: wife's name. Marriage date. Date of admission to St. Augustine Retreat for the Feeble-Minded. Final note, always the same 3 words: condition irreversible, discharged. No causes. No physician's signature. Just the same looping script, as if written by the same hand over decades. I flipped further. Some pages were completely blacked out with tar-like paint, thick enough that it cracked under my thumb. On the inside cover, in a faded pencil scrawl, was a question: do you believe in the hollow doctrine? I didn't. Not yet. When I stepped back, my flashlight caught something above the cabinet, a dusty framed photograph hanging slightly askew. It showed a tall man in a 3-piece suit, his face pale and sharp, standing before the very same building I was in. Behind him were 5 women, each with the same distant, glassy stare. None of them seemed aware the photo was being taken. A water droplet fell from the ceiling and landed on the man's printed eyes, blurring them into a smear. I should have closed the drawer and walked away. I could have told myself that whatever happened was a century-old footnote best left to the cemetery stones. But the ledger had been hidden. The photograph had been preserved. Someone had wanted this buried, which meant someone else had suffered to keep it that way. And if the Hartwell name appeared in municipal ledgers, it meant there was a paper trail. Paper trails rot, but they also persist, waiting for the right set of hands. I'd been called a salvage journalist before, the one who dug up stories that were supposed to stay dead. This wasn't my fight, but it had become my obligation. As I slid the ledger into my satchel, I realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from an awful, growing certainty. Those 5 wives had not simply gone insane. And if the hollow doctrine was more than an old local superstition, then the Hartwell story hadn't ended at all. It had only been waiting for someone like me to find it. The name, St. Augustine Retreat for the Feeble-Minded, didn't appear in the county index under hospitals or clinics. It was listed under private benevolent associations, tucked between a temperance society and an orphanage that no longer existed. The official charter I pulled from the State Historical Archive was brittle and water-stained, but the wording was pristine, ornate, deliberate. Founded in the year of our Lord 1848, the retreat shall serve as a haven for the morally afflicted, the constitutionally fragile, and those whose minds are weakened by the trials of domestic life. It read like scripture and diagnosis in the same breath. The founder, Reverend Elijah Hartwell, was praised in county bulletins as a man of boundless compassion and fortitude, a clergyman who'd studied continental methods of nervous rehabilitation in Belgium and Prussia. He was depicted in woodcut portraits with a long, severe face and eyes that seemed to look slightly above the viewer's head, as if measuring them against some invisible mark. According to the pamphlets, the ones meant for donors and visiting clergy, St. Augustine was a place of rest. Patients were given sermons to soothe the spirit and regimens to temper the humors. There was a picture of a sunlit lawn where women in white gowns read under elm trees, their faces turned away from the camera. But in the ledger I'd found, not a single wife ever had a discharge date that included a return to family. The euphemism discharged seemed to mean removed from all record. I drove out to where the retreat had once stood, 3 miles beyond the current town limits, near the river bend where the ground turned to marsh. All that remained was the foundation, broad granite blocks under a tangle of weeds. The front step still jutted upward to nothing, and at the top, carved into the keystone, was the phrase, per veritatem mentem purificamus. Through truth, we purify the mind. The county records from 1871 onward became thin. Entire years were missing. A letter from the State Board of Charities, preserved only because it had been misfiled with land deeds, hinted at the real policy: inmates showing no outward signs of improvement are to remain under care indefinitely, for release would invite relapse and scandal upon the community. The phrase, invite scandal, lodged in my mind. It implied the wives were not just patients but liabilities, people who, if they spoke freely, could undermine something larger than themselves. I managed to find one living source, an elderly nurse named Clara Jennings, whose grandmother had trained at St. Augustine before the First World War. She agreed to speak on the condition I not record her voice. Sitting in her kitchen, she stirred her tea without looking up. They called it the hollow doctrine, she said. It was Reverend Hartwell's rule. The mind is a vessel, and if it's cracked, you empty it before you try to mend it. They didn't treat the women, they emptied them. Her grandmother had described emptying as long hours in the chapel's basement, in a room with no light, no sound except the tick of a brass metronome. Some women came out compliant, others never came out at all. Hartwell died in 1892, but the institution carried on under new administrators, still under church oversight. Its last patient intake was in 1946. By then, the world had new names for the same cruelty: rest cures, quiet wards, therapeutic isolation. And yet, not one obituary, census entry, or marriage certificate ever confirmed a former patient lived in the town again. Looking at the surviving records, I saw the same last name 5 times, spaced across decades: Hartwell. Reverend Elijah's sons had each taken leadership in turn, their signatures steady and confident on the intake forms. The first sign of what St. Augustine really did to its patients wasn't in a ledger or an obituary. It was in the letters. The State Archive had a thin folder labeled Correspondence, approved for delivery. Inside were maybe 24 envelopes, each addressed in a different hand but all carrying the same inward-turning language: I am very well here. I am receiving the finest care. Please do not trouble yourself with visits. It was the sameness that unnerved me. Different senders, different years, but every letter followed the same structure, as though copied from a single script. Even the handwriting, though not identical, carried the same slow, rounded shape, the same over-precise loops. Cross-referencing the names, I found 5 that matched entries in the hidden ledger. The most striking was a woman named Margaret Linton, admitted in 1904. Her letters began warm, conversational. By the 3rd year, they were entirely formulaic. By the 5th, the signature was just an M. A margin note in the 1908 staff log, in the same slanted script I'd seen before, read: patient forgets Christian name on prompting. Commendable progress. I traced another woman's record, Hannah Royce. In the earliest intake form, she'd given her birth date, parents' names, and a short personal statement: I am not ill, but my husband insists I must rest. In her final, approved letter home, there was no mention of her past at all, just a single sentence: I have found my purpose here. I wanted to believe these were anomalies, but the deeper I went, the more erasures I found. Not just in the letters, in the official census. Whole names dropped from the rolls mid-decade, replaced by anonymous notations like domestic resident or inmate 14. On one visit to the overgrown ruins, I noticed a short retaining wall near the collapsed chapel. It had once been decorative, the kind of stonework common in late Victorian landscaping. But in the lichen-softened surface, I could make out faint carvings, first names. Dozens of them. Anna. Grace. Lucinda. Margaret. Each one had been chiseled over, gouged until only shallow ghosts of the letters remained. The archivist who'd been helping me mentioned an oddity in a private collection nearby, an album of portraits said to be gifts from the retreat. I arranged to view it. The photographs were formal, stiff, taken against the same draped background. Each woman sat upright, hands folded, gazing somewhere past the lens. No smiles, no variation in posture. The only difference was the name penciled in under each image, single names only, as though surnames had been discarded. In the final pages, even those were gone. Just blank spaces where the names should have been. Two figures began to surface in my notes. One was Nurse Mary Whitcomb, whose personnel file had been marked resigned, without incident. But in the margin of a chapel service schedule, I found a penciled line in her hand: "They pray until they forget what they are praying for." The other was a junior groundskeeper, Thomas Bell, who'd been dismissed for excessive fraternization with residents. His only surviving letter, unsent and found folded in a hymn book, read, "The hollow doctrine is not a cure. It is a removal." The most haunting discovery came on my last trip to the ruins. In what had been the east wing, a rusted door gave way to a long, windowless room. Shelves lined both walls, stacked high with leather suitcases. Each was tagged in neat, faded script: Linton, Royce, Whitcomb, Hartwell. Hundreds of them. No duplicates, no missing numbers. I stood there for a long time, breathing the dust of other people's lives, wondering if they'd even remember these cases existed, if they could. When I finally turned to leave, I passed the small chapel at the center of the grounds. The door was ajar. Inside, the air was cold, though the day was warm. From somewhere in the empty space came the sound of weeping, low, rhythmic, steady. But when I stepped inside, there was no one there. It took 3 visits before I found the access point. The East Wing's foundation had collapsed inward decades ago, leaving a sinkhole of warped brick and rusted pipes. But on the 3rd trip, brushing away loose soil near the old laundry room, I found the iron lip of a service hatch. It wasn't on any blueprint I'd studied. The lock had long since fused with rust. I wedged it open with a tire iron and dropped into darkness, the air thick with the smell of wet stone and something sharper, opium resin, faint but unmistakable. My flashlight beam revealed a corridor carved into the bedrock. The walls were slick, the mortar weeping in slow droplets that caught the light like tiny eyes. Every 10 feet, the ceiling arched into narrow vaults, each with a set of hooks bolted overhead. At first I thought they were for laundry lines, until I saw the worn grooves beneath them, places where something heavy had swung for years. I moved deeper. The hallway forked, both branches leading to sealed oak doors. One had been bricked over from the inside. The other, when I pressed against it, gave a slow reluctant sigh and opened onto a stairwell that spiraled downward far longer than the building's original foundation should have allowed. Halfway down, I realized the stairs didn't descend in a straight coil, they bent subtly, looping back toward themselves. I passed the same wall fissure 3 times, though I hadn't turned around. My breathing quickened. The sound echoed too much, as if someone else matched it a few steps behind. At the bottom, the stairs ended in a long, low chamber lit only by the beam of my light. Against one wall stood a row of high-backed wooden chairs, each fitted with leather straps and headrests. A decayed cabinet nearby held glass vials labeled laudanum, morphia, aqua fortis. One shelf contained metronomes, each frozen mid-swing, their pendulums caught in perfect stillness. On a table in the center of the room was a leather-bound journal, its spine warped but pages intact. The entries were in Reverend Hartwell's hand. January 3rd, patient submitted to the hollowness at last. No more remembrance of kin or sin. March 11th, candles extinguished themselves twice during prayer. Presume atmospheric draft. April 2nd, saw her reflection moving when her body sat still. Corrected with opiate dose. I closed the book, my hands cold despite the damp heat of the chamber. In the far corner, a standing mirror leaned against the wall, its silver backing mottled with age. When I passed in front of it, my reflection lagged half a second behind, lips parting as if to speak. I told myself it was the warped glass. Further in, I found a smaller passage. The walls here were raw stone, carved with Latin phrases that crumbled when touched. The tunnel ended in a vaulted prayer room. Candles lined the floor in neat rows, all blackened at the tips. As I stepped inside, one flickered back to life, its tiny flame bending toward me like a living thing. My rational mind whispered explanations, phosphine gas, drafts, afterimages, but the skin on my arms prickled in that deep, involuntary way that ignores reason. I backed out slowly, but as I did, I noticed something impossible. The room behind me seemed to breathe. The air expanded and contracted, a slow inhale, exhale, as if the stone itself remembered every sob, every prayer uttered in the dark. When I finally climbed back to the surface, I checked my watch. I'd been below for 20 minutes. My car's dashboard clock said I'd been gone for nearly 2 hours. I'd thought St. Augustine was the story. A single rotting tooth in the jaw of history. But the more I dug, the more I saw its decay branching outward, like a root system I'd only just exposed. It started with a folded map tucked in the back of Hartwell's journal, a map that didn't match the local topography. Small crosses marked towns in other states: Durham, Amherst, Wethersfield, Milford. Next to each was a date, always between 1848 and 1936, and a name in tidy script. At first I assumed they were places Reverend Hartwell had preached. Then I recognized one, Rose Hill Temperance Home, Massachusetts. I'd read about it in passing. School for girls that closed in 1911 after a fire. In a digitized ledger from its final year, I found familiar phrases: quiet ward, moral repair, hollow preparation. The same Latin motto from the St. Augustine keystone, per veritatem mentem purificamus, appeared on its seal. I started pulling more threads. The Durham House for Reformed Women, the Amherst Chapel Annex, the Milford Refuge. All gone now, but their intake forms were identical, down to the spacing of the lines, the phrasing of reason for admission, and a curious column titled Degree of Hollowness Achieved. The handwriting varied only slightly, as if each was penned by someone trained to copy a style. In the county clerk's office, I found a dusty, unmarked binder that wasn't in the index. Inside were typed pages, each listing multiple institutions by city, founder, and overseer. At the top of every page, in a serif typeface, was a heading, the Order of the Fifth Veil. The list wasn't long, 22 institutions over 90 years, but the coverage was wide: Maine to Illinois, Ohio to Georgia. Each had closed quietly, without public scandal, and in each case, the final administrator bore one of 6 surnames: Hartwell, Gibbons, Sterling, Linton, Royce, Bell. It wasn't just that the Hartwells had passed St. Augustine down the family line. They had relatives, allies, and perhaps blood ties woven into other towns, other buildings. The last page of the binder stopped me cold. It was a roster titled Continuing Members, Post, 1960. There were no institution names, just initials and a city of residence. One set of initials matched my own grandfather, a man I'd known as a mild-mannered school board trustee. He died when I was a teenager. I never once heard him mention St. Augustine, or anything like it. And yet, in the margins beside his name, someone had written in pencil, Keeper of the Hollow, Central Division. I traced the note with my finger, the paper rough against my skin. Suddenly, the lines between past and present weren't clean. This wasn't history I was sifting through, it was a current that still ran beneath my own feet. On the last page, a symbol was embossed faintly into the paper, a 5-layered circle, each ring broken at a different point, like concentric veils being drawn back. I'd seen it before, carved into the stone threshold of the prayer room in the ruins, so faint I thought it was just damage. Now I understood. The prayer rooms, the metronomes, the erased names, they were not peculiarities of one man's cruelty. They were the order's method. A method refined over generations, exported like scripture, adapted to new towns, new patients. The only variable was the building. The ritual never changed. I closed the binder and realized I was shaking again, not from fear but from a colder realization. If the order of the fifth veil still existed, then somewhere, right now, the hollow doctrine was still being applied, maybe in a church basement, maybe in a clinic down the street. And if my own family's name was written in their margins, then I wasn't just an investigator anymore. I was a loose thread they might want to cut. I'd been ready to publish. Every file, every photograph, every map was arranged on my desk in careful order, ready to be scanned and sent to editors. My notes sprawled like a nervous system, every institution, every name, every date connected by red pencil lines. That's when the phone rang. No number. Just a voice, older, female, deliberate. You need to see for yourself before you decide. She gave an address on the edge of town. I almost didn't go. But something in her tone, not pleading, not threatening, left no room for refusal. The house was small, its paint worn thin by weather. Inside, in a room lined with blackout curtains, sat a woman in her 60s. She introduced herself as Clara Jennings' niece. Her aunt, the nurse who'd told me about emptying, had died last year. But she'd left something behind. She slid a cassette tape across the table. The label read simply, Chapel, August 1987. I pressed play. The first sound was murmured prayer. Then the scrape of a chair. A younger woman's voice, trembling, "Do you think it matters if I get out? Because I can't remember my sister's face anymore. I think that means I'm already gone." A man's voice replied, calm, practiced, gentle in the way arsenic is gentle, "Then let us take the rest, so you can be free." There was a soft weeping, and then the metronome began. The niece watched me, her hands clasped. They still meet. They don't call it St. Augustine anymore. They rent basements. Community centers. My aunt said it's smaller now, but more deliberate. Children, sometimes. She led me to the back of the house. Through a narrow hallway and down 2 steps was a locked door. She unlocked it. The room beyond was empty except for a single folding chair, a desk, and a metronome on its side. But in the far corner was a child, maybe 12, sitting cross-legged, hands over ears, rocking. "This is Ruth," the niece said. "Her mother thinks she's in a church youth program. They told me she was being corrected. She hasn't spoken in weeks. Won't say her own name. If you publish everything, they'll scatter. We'll lose her. If you stay quiet, we can get her out." The words felt like a trap. Publish, and expose a century of cruelty, but sacrifice the few still reachable. Stay silent, and become complicit in the same silence that had preserved the order for generations. I crouched beside the girl. "Ruth?" I asked. She didn't look up. "I can take you home." Her lips moved, barely. I leaned closer. "Will it matter if I get out?" My throat tightened. I had no answer. Back in my apartment, I sat before the files. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Somewhere in the ruins of St. Augustine, I could still hear the steady tick of that metronome, the breath of the stones. I took the ledger, the first thing I'd ever found, and set it in my kitchen sink. I lit a match. The pages curled inward, blackened, the ink dissolving into smoke. I didn't burn everything. Just enough to erase the threads that led directly to Ruth. The rest, I kept. For now. On my desk, I left one candle lit, its small flame bending toward the ledger's ash, and walked out, locking the door behind me. They called it a structural failure. A collapse in the west wing triggered by a faulty beam, followed by a fire that spread too quickly to contain. The press release was 3 sentences long. No mention of the children. No mention of the wards. No mention of the rooms that should never have existed. By the time the embers cooled, the walls were already gone, knocked down in the name of safety. Blackened stone was swept away in unmarked trucks. The official photographs were cropped to show only the undamaged parts, the smoke rising just enough to blur the background. The catalogue of what survived was brief: a warped metal bed frame, a melted rosary, a fragment of a ledger with half a name. Everything else, they said, had been too damaged to save. But the survivors, those few who spoke, insisted that the fire had been too clean. The locked drawers were empty. The filing cabinets stood open, their contents gone before the flames touched them. Somewhere in the rubble, they found a locket. It was small, brass, the clasp rusted shut. No photograph inside, only a scrap of paper folded too many times, the ink blurred from sweat or tears. The writing was almost illegible, but the first 3 letters spelled a name no one could remember. In the days that followed, trucks came at night. The ground was dug and redug, the soil turned until even the bones looked misplaced. Some were reburied under false markers, others vanished entirely. The registry in the county office was updated to reflect new numbers, neat columns of names that never existed, births that never happened. When the investigators asked about the strange gaps, whole decades missing from the archives, they were told the records had been lost in the fire. But the building had stood for 78 years. Not one photograph of its earliest days remained. Not one letter, diary, or drawing. It was as if the place had appeared fully formed one night and burned away the next. The town adapted quickly. The plot of land was fenced off, the fence wrapped in tarpaulins so no one could see the hollow center where the foundation had been. They planted grass over the scars, put up a plaque, site of the old St. Aurelia School, closed 1979. People stopped asking questions. Or maybe they were told to stop. But on quiet nights, when the air hung thick with fog, some swore they could hear voices inside the fence line. Children's prayers, muttered and restless. The sound of desks scraping against the floor. Once, someone claimed they saw a candle burning where the chapel used to be. And there was the other thing. Weeks after the fire, the demolition crew reported finding a locked drawer they hadn't opened. They left it in the foreman's trailer, planning to force it open later. By morning, it was gone. In its place, on the table where it had been, was a single black ribbon, tied in a neat bow. Years later, the survivors still met in secret. They didn't speak of the building directly. They spoke of the missing years, of birthdays that felt wrong, of family members who swore they never existed. And always, someone would ask the same question: do you think it could happen again? No one ever answered. The wind moved through the grass where the school had been, bending it in slow, deliberate waves, as if something beneath the soil was breathing. 4.